Just when Diep thought the nightmare had ended, just when James finally made it home, something far darker slipped quietly into their world. Last night, their wooden house was filled with relief. Warm porridge, soft lamplight, and the steady breathing of the man who had fought his way back from the edge. But this morning, a shadow moved through the bamboo grove. Dawn growled, and the truth James carried home with him finally began to rise to the surface. A truth not tied to his journey, but to Diep's past. A past she never imagined could reach her. A past someone dangerous has now remembered. And today, you'll discover the warning that arrived at their door. If this story moves you, or if you want to follow every twist of James and Diep's journey, please consider subscribing. Your support keeps this small series alive, and it truly means the world to us. The bamboo grove behind the house was usually quiet at this hour of the morning. Birds fluttered between branches, sunlight shimmered through leaves, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and green. But today, something felt off. Diep stood frozen just a few steps outside the porch. Her breath caught halfway in her chest. Dawn, normally the gentlest dog in the village, was rigid, tail stiff, ears pointed forward, fur bristling all along his back. His eyes were fixed on the grove as if he could see something she could not. "Dawn," Diep whispered, "what is it?" The dog didn't move. Inside the house, James tried to sit up when he heard the barking, wincing at the pain that shot up his leg. "Diep, what's happening?" he called out, his voice strained. Diep didn't answer immediately. The leaves rustled again, a slow, deliberate shift, not like the wind. She scanned the shadows between the bamboo stalks, searching for any unfamiliar shape. Nothing. And yet, something was there. She felt it. Finally, she backed away, keeping her eyes on the grove until she was safely under the roof of the porch. "It's nothing," she said softly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Probably just an animal. James knew she was lying. He had lived with her long enough to understand her silences. The way she bit the inside of her cheek when she was nervous. The way her hands trembled just slightly when she forced herself to say, "It's nothing." "Diep," he said quietly, "tell me." She turned toward him, worry knotted in her brows. "There was someone," she admitted. "Not an animal. Dawn doesn't bark like that unless it's a person." James's jaw tightened. "Inside the grove?" he asked. She nodded. James swallowed hard. "That means—" "I know," Diep whispered. "It means someone might have followed you home." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. James shifted again and winced as pain struck his ankle. "Can you help me sit?" he asked. "James, no," Diep said immediately. "The medic told you to rest." "I can't rest," he murmured, eyes fixed on the grove. "Not if someone is out there." Diep hesitated, then moved to his side, propping him up with the pillows and helping him lean against the headboard. He sucked in a sharp breath, fighting the ache. "Better?" she asked quietly. "Better," he lied. The room felt smaller now. The wooden walls, the low ceiling, the thin mattress. James looked around as if suddenly aware of how vulnerable everything was. How open, how exposed. "Diep," he said softly, "I need to tell you the rest." She turned to him slowly, her heartbeat rising like a wave. "The rest of what?" James looked down at his hands. "I didn't want to talk about it yesterday. I was too tired." too afraid of making it sound worse than it was. He swallowed. But I think you deserve to know. Diep sat beside him. I'm listening. James took a breath. The night I helped that boy escape, he began, I thought it ended there. I thought the worst thing that would happen to me was walking on a bad leg. Diep's breath trembled. But after I left the farmer's house, after the footsteps in the forest, James paused, rubbing his forehead. I realized something. Diep leaned closer. Realized what? He lifted his eyes, voice barely above a whisper, that the men weren't chasing me. Diep froze. What do you mean? They weren't calling my name, James said. They weren't looking for me. A cold weight settled in Diep's stomach. They were looking for a woman, he continued, and when they said her name, it wasn't mine. He hesitated, but it sounded like yours. Diep's pulse quickened. You think they were looking for me? She whispered. James didn't answer immediately, but silence was an answer too. Diep felt her fingers go numb as she stared at him. Then a soft thud echoed outside. Diep flinched. James jerked upright despite the pain. It came from the back, he said. Diep rushed to the window and peeked through the wooden slats. Nothing moved. But something had definitely been there. The bamboo stalk still swayed unnaturally, like someone had slipped past just seconds earlier. She turned back to James. What if, she whispered, what if they knew where I lived? James inhaled sharply. I should have told you sooner, James said. I should have told you everything the moment I walked into this house. Diep shook her head fiercely. No, you came home half broken. You barely made it alive. There's no blame here. He stared at her, at the calm strength in her eyes, the way her hand protectively covered her belly, the way she stood between him and the door, as if she could shield him from the world. How long were they looking for her? James asked himself out loud, thinking back to the forest, the storm, the muddy roads. Why her? Why now? Diep lowered her gaze. I don't know, she said, but I don't think this started when you were gone. James's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Diep hesitated, then told him. The stranger who came to the village, she whispered. The one who asked about a woman. James went still. What did he ask? He said slowly. He didn't know my name, Diep replied, but he described me, down to my height, my hair, even the color of the shirt I wore that day. James's breath caught. That wasn't random, he muttered. That wasn't rumor. Diep shook her head. No, she said. It wasn't. For a long second, they simply stared at each other, two people who had survived storms and separation and near loss, now realizing the real danger had only just begun. The bamboo grove rustled again. Dawn let out a low, warning growl. Diep whispered, James, this isn't over, is it? James looked toward the grove, jaw tightening, eyes sharpening. No, he said quietly. It's just beginning. And as Diep stood frozen in the yard, listening to that unnatural rustle in the bamboo grove, something shifted in the air. Don didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared, unmoving, as if he recognized the presence hiding in the shadows. Inside the house, James tried to stand, pain shooting up his leg, calling her name, but Diep couldn't answer him. Not yet. Not when something, or someone, was watching them from beyond the trees. Because this time, the danger wasn't coming from across the border. It wasn't tied to James's journey. It was here for her. A past she didn't remember. a name she thought she had buried, a danger that had walked quietly through the bamboo long before James ever returned home. And in part 2, the warning left at their doorstep will expose the first piece of a truth that could destroy everything James fought to save. If you've come this far into the journey of James and Diep, you won't want to miss what comes next. In part 1 of this episode, peace finally seems to return to Diep's home. James is recovering from his collapse. The house is quiet again, and for the first time in days, fear loosens its grip. But that calm doesn't last long. Early in the morning, Dawn senses something outside. A presence moving through the bamboo grove, slow and deliberate, unlike any ordinary wind. Diep steps out to investigate, but the deeper she looks, the heavier the silence becomes. James, still weak, calls out from inside, but Diep cannot respond. Because what's watching them isn't connected to James's journey. It's tied to her, to a past she never expected to face again. And as a shadow lingers just beyond the trees, the danger waiting for them begins to reveal itself.